The young samurai stood at the edge of the dojo. The clean, sun-warmed scent of tatami mats weaving with the delicate bitterness of freshly whisked matcha. His master moved through the kata with the effortless precision of flowing water, each step a whisper against the polished wooden floor, each breath drawn as evenly as the turning of the seasons. The blade of the katana caught the pale morning light as it arced through the air, a fleeting crescent moon, its passage marked only by the faintest sigh of steel parting nothingness. The boy's own fingers twitched at his sides, restless, as if they could already feel the hilt of his own sword nestled there, imperfect and untested. The weight of his family's name pressed upon his shoulders like the heavy silk of a formal kimono, embroidered with generations of expectation. He could hear his father's voice, low and unyielding as the roots of the ancestral cedar outside their home. Honor is not given, it is forged. Every morning, the same ritual kneeling before the family shrine, the smoke of incense curling like the ghosts of his forebears, watching, waiting. The master's kata ended in silence. The final motion a stillness so complete it seemed to freeze even the dust motes drifting in the shafts of light. The boy exhaled, unaware he had been holding his breath. His palms were damp against the rough fabric of his hakama. The teacup beside him had gone cold, its surface a mirror of the overcast sky outside. He lifted it anyway, the porcelain smooth and cool against his lips, the tea's bitterness grounding him, a fleeting echo of the master's teachings. Perfection is not the absence of flaw, but the acceptance of it. Outside, the rhythmic clatter of geta on cobbled stones marked the passage of villagers beginning their day, their lives untouched by the silent war raging within him. His gaze drifted to the sword rack, where his own blade rested unadorned, unproven. He recalled the first time he had held it, the way the weight had felt both foreign and familiar, like a limb he had always been missing. Yet now, it was inseparable from the dread pooling in his gut. What if his hands were too weak, his spirit too fractured? What if the sword, when finally drawn in true battle, revealed not a warrior's heart, but a coward's? The wind brushed through the open shoji screens, carrying the damp earth scent of impending rain, stirring the ends of his bound hair. Somewhere beyond the courtyard, a temple bell tolled, deep and resonant, a sound that seemed to pull at something ancient within him. The master's stillness shifted, then a single, deliberate inhalation, the slight unfurling of his spine, and the boy understood. This was the lesson, not the flawless cut, but the breath before it. Not the absence of fear, but the mastery of it. The tea's dregs swirled at the bottom of his cup. Tiny leaves like sediment settled at the riverbed of his thoughts. He closed his eyes, let the world narrow to the rise and fall of his chest, the distant caw of a crow, the whisper of silk as he bent forward to set the cup down. When he opened them again, the master was watching him, eyes reflecting the patience of stone and the sharpness of flint. The boy bowed low, forehead brushing the tatami, the scent of straw and wax filling his nostrils. In that moment, he felt it not the crushing certainty of victory, but the fragile, quiet peace of surrender. The path was endless, but his feet were upon it. That, at least, was enough. The young samurai knelt on the tatami, the clean scent of straw and sea salt soaking through the air, and closed his eyes. Beneath him, the mat breathed a whisper of resilience, woven like the code he strained to uphold. The chasen clinked against the chowan as he whisked matcha into froth, the bitter green aroma curling into his senses, a taste both familiar and unforgiving. Outside, the dawn wind carried petals from the courtyard cherry tree. They brushed the shoji screen like the ghosts of his ancestors, restless. He knew their stories by heart, the uncle who held the mountain pass alone until reinforcements came, the grandfather whose blade had turned an ambush into legend, yet his own hands trembled when he lifted the tea bowl. The smooth lacquer mocked him. This too, his swordmaster would say, is part of the cut. Every motion mattered, the angle of his wrist, the pause before swallowing, the way his breath hitched when he imagined his father's disappointment. The katana leaned against the wall, its saya catching a sliver of sunlight. Some mornings, he dared not touch it. To draw the blade was to hear the silence of the dojo, the faint shick of steel leaving the scabbard, the way the air parted before it, thinner than paper, sharper than shame. He inhaled, and the scent of oiled metal and pine resin filled his lungs. Meditation was supposed to steady him, but today his mind writhed like the summer river behind the shrine, swollen with rains he couldn't control. What if his foot slid mid-form? What if his strike faltered when the moment demanded perfection? The cobbled streets beyond the gate echoed with the rhythmic clatter of geta, sandals' ordinary lives passing, unburdened by bloodlines. Sweat pricked his palms. He pressed them to his thighs, the silk of his hakama cool against his skin. On the kamidana, the ancestral plaque watched. The candle flickered. A wisp of smoke curled toward the ceiling, carrying prayers he couldn't voice. Again he thought. The tea was bitter, the blade was patient, and the gods, if they listened at all, measured a man's worth in breaths, not victories. He bowed lower, forehead to the mat. Somewhere a bell tolled once, twice timeless as the tide. The petal on the threshold shuddered and held fast. The evening air carried the delicate perfume of cherry blossoms, mingling with the crisp scent of freshly laid tatami as the young samurai knelt in the dojo, his calloused fingers tracing the smooth seam of his hakama. The sharp shink of his master's blade being drawn echoed like a whisper of winter wind, though the old man's movement was fluid as a river, effortless, inevitable. The boy's own breath hitched, and he caught the bitter aftertaste of matcha lingering on his tongue, a reminder of the tea ceremony he had fumbled that morning, his hands trembling ever so slightly as he lifted the bowl. Outside, the rhythmic clop-clop of geta on cobblestones faded into the distance, leaving only the hum of cicadas and the weight of his thoughts. Again, he chided himself, still uneven. The ancestral swords mounted on the alcove seemed to watch him, their polished steel catching the last amber light of day. And his chest tightened with the old fear, the fear that his bloodline's legacy would fray in his unworthy hands, that his father's ghost would turn away in shame. Sensei's voice, dry as aged parchment, broke the silence. "You prepare tea as if it were a battle," he observed, and the boy flinched at the truth in it. He had counted every breath, every ripple in the water, yet perfection eluded him like mist through fingers. The master knelt beside him, the folds of his indigo robe whispering against the tatami, and lifted the ladle with a grace that made the boy's throat ache. "Tonight," the old man said, "you will meditate beneath the sakura, not to master stillness, but to let it master you." The words coiled around the boy's heart like incense smoke, stirring a memory, his mother's voice, years ago, telling him how the blossoms fell without regret, how even their fleeting beauty was rebellion against the tyranny of time. As dusk deepened, he arranged the meditation cushion beneath the tree's gnarled branches, the bark cool and rough under his palm. Petals dusted his shoulders like snow, their sweetness thickening the air, and for a moment he was a child again, chasing them in the courtyard as his father laughed. Now the laughter was gone and only duty remained. He settled into seiza, the earth firm beneath him, and closed his eyes, but the silence roared. The wind rustled the blossoms. A lone nightingale called, its song trembling like the unshed tears behind his ribs. "Breathe," he commanded himself, yet each inhalation shuddered with the effort of holding back the storm inside. Then a shift. The moon's glow painted his eyelids silver, and the sakura's shadow danced across his face, fleeting as a swordsman's strike. In that fragile light, he imagined the generations before him kneeling just so, their struggles and triumphs woven into the same endless night. The cherry tree had stood for centuries, its roots drinking the prayers of forgotten men, and the thought humbled him. Perfection was not a destination, he realized, but the act of returning to the breath, to the moment, to the craft again and again, even when his hands shook. A petal brushed his cheek, light as a ghost's touch, and for the first time he let go. The ancestors needed no monuments. They lived in the discipline of his wrist, the patience of his spine, the quiet rhythm of his heart matching the pulse of the earth beneath him. The breeze stilled. The night held its breath. And in that suspension between the fall of one blossom and the next, he found not perfection, but peace. The young samurai knelt in the dim glow of the single candle, the scent of fresh tatami, and the faint, earthy aroma of green tea lingering in the still air. The blade of his katana lay bare across his lap, its edge catching the flickering light like a sliver of frozen moonlight. His hands moved with practiced precision, the smooth, rhythmic strokes of the cloth against steel, the faint hiss of oil settling into the metal. Each pass was a prayer, a meditation, yet beneath the calm, his pulse betrayed him. the weight of his ancestors' legacy pressed against his ribs like the flat of a blade, silent but unyielding. He could almost hear the whispers of the old masters, their voices woven into the very steel he tended, their expectations sharper than the weapon itself. The tea beside him had gone cold, its bitterness a mirror to the doubt coiled in his gut. Had his father felt this fear? Had his grandfather's hands trembled ever so slightly as they prepared for battle? The thought made his breath catch. Outside, the wind stirred, rustling the cherry blossoms against the shoji screen, their petals drifting like snow, beautiful, fleeting, a reminder of the impermanence he was sworn to defy. His master's words echoed, "A sword is only as steady as the spirit behind it." The cloth stilled in his grip. He closed his eyes, seeking the stillness within, the place where the chaos of his thoughts might settle like dust in undisturbed water. The distant clatter of kata on cobblestones, the sigh of the night breeze, the cool touch of the wooden floor beneath his knees, all anchors to the present. He inhaled, slow and deliberate, as if drawing in the resolve of generations. The blade, now gleaming, reflected not just his face, but the lineage etched into his bones. Perfection was not the absence of fear, he realized, but the mastery of it. As he sheathed the katana with a whisper-soft click, the weight in his chest lightened, if only for this moment. The tea's bitterness, now sipped, tasted like truth. The first light of dawn had yet to touch the sky when the young samurai inhaled the crisp, pre-dawn air. The stillness broken only by the distant cry of a night heron, the scent of fresh tatami clean straw mingling with the faint musk of aged wood settled around him as he knelt in the dojo. The polished floor cool beneath his calloused palms. A single candle flickered, casting long shadows that danced like restless spirits along the walls. His sword lay before him, its scabbard smooth as river-worn stone, the dragon etched into its surface, a silent guardian of generations past. His fingers brushed the hilt, trembling ever so slightly before curling around the wrappings, the rough silk biting into his skin. The blade whispered as it left the saya, a sound like winter wind through bare branches, and in that breath between stillness and motion, he hesitated. His shoulders were heavy not with exhaustion, but with the weight of his ancestors' stares, their silent judgments carved into the marrow of his bones. Again, he heard his sword master's voice, not unkind, but unbending. A blade must be an extension of the soul, yet his own soul felt frayed, tangled between duty and dread. Each strike he practiced in the dim light a plea for perfection, and a fear that his hands would never be worthy. The first step into the opening form was stiff, his hips unyielding as if the ghosts of his forebears clutched at his hakama, their disapproval thickening the air like incense smoke. The tea he'd drunk earlier bitter as unripe persimmon churned in his stomach. His breath hitched, uneven, betraying him. Why can't I? The thought dissolved as his foot scraped against the floor, the sound obscenely loud in the sacred silence. Outside, the wind sighed through the pine trees, a sound older than the clan's lineage, older than the gods whose names were etched into the shrine gates. He forced his lungs to still, counting heartbeats like the temple bell counted hours 1, 2, until the rhythm of his pulse echoed the steady drip of dew from the eaves. The sky was lightening now, indigo bleeding into the palest gray, and with it came the scent of damp earth, of moss clinging to stone. Life returning, always returning. His next breath drew in the fragrance of green tea cooling beside him, steam curling like the mist over the koi pond where he'd knelt yesterday, watching his reflection shatter and reform with every ripple. Mastery is not in the blade, but in the yielding, his master had murmured, too wise to speak the rest aloud. That perfection was a mountain with no peak. That honor lay not in the strike, but in the hand that chose when to strike. The young samurai exhaled, long and slow. And this time, as he raised the katana, his wrists remembered their ease. The blade caught the first gold thread of sunrise, scattering light like a handful of rice thrown to the shrine crows, a fleeting offering, beautiful because it did not last. His muscles warmed, his steps softened, and though his forms were not yet flawless, they were no longer fearful. Somewhere beyond the garden walls, a sparrow sang. The world turned, the gods watched, and for now, that was enough. The young samurai knelt on the tatami mat, the sharp scent of fresh straw and polished wood filling his nostrils as morning light filtered through the shoji screens, painting pale gold streaks across the floor. His fingers trembled ever so slightly against his thighs, the same trembling that had plagued him yesterday during kenjutsu practice, when his blade had faltered mid-strike, the imperceptible hitch in his draw enough to earn a single, weighted glance from his master. Now the silence between them stretched like a taut bowstring, broken only by the distant cry of a circling hawk and the whisper of wind through the pines outside. He could still taste the metallic sting of failure on his tongue, bitter as oversteeped tea. His thoughts spiraling, how many more sunrises before my ancestors turn their backs? Before the gods see the weakness in my bones? The weight of centuries pressed upon his shoulders, every stroke of his sword, judged against the legacy of warriors whose names were etched in temple scrolls, their victories sung like lullabies in his childhood. His master shifted then, the rustle of silk against silk, as deliberate as the turning of seasons. The old man's hands, gnarled yet steady as mountain roots, lifted the iron kettle, steam curling in tendrils like incense offerings to the kami. Without a word, he poured water into the chowan, the liquid's soft cascade a counterpoint to the young man's ragged breaths. "Join me," the master said, voice as calm as a still pond, and though it was no command, the samurai obeyed, the smooth lacquer of the tea bowl cool against his palms as he accepted it. The ceremony unfolded in the space between heartbeats, the whisk's rhythmic swirl, the earthy fragrance of matcha rising like a prayer, the deliberate pause before the first sip. Here there was no blade to wield, no enemies to slay, only the act itself. The way the light caught the glaze of the bowl, the warmth seeping into his fingertips, the faint sweetness beneath the bitterness as he drank. With each sip, the clamor in his mind stilled. The cobbled streets of his nightly walks where his kata clattered like the restless ghosts of his doubts faded into silence. Even the distant temple bell, tolling the hour like a reminder of time's passage, seemed to soften. His master's eyes, deep as river stones, held no judgment, only the tacit wisdom of one who had long ago learned to bend without breaking. This, the young man realized, is also mastery. Not the flawless arc of a sword, but the patience to let the steam rise at its own pace, to feel the weight of the bowl as an extension of his own hands, to honor the simplicity of a moment untouched by ambition. The ancestors had not demanded perfection, only presence. As the last drops of tea lingered on his tongue, the weight in his chest eased, replaced by something quieter, older, the understanding that peace was not the absence of fear, but the discipline to carry it without stumbling. Outside, the hawk's cry echoed again, this time joined by the rustle of maple leaves, a reminder that even the wind must learn when to yield. The young samurai knelt on the tatami mat, the clean, sun-warmed scent of woven straw mingling with the faintly bitter aroma of freshly whisked matcha. His hands hovered above the chowin, fingers trembling ever so slightly as he fought to steady them. The tea bowl's rim felt cool and smooth beneath his fingertips, yet it might as well have been a blade's edge for how it exposed his imperfection. Outside, the whisper of autumn leaves brushing against the shoji screens was drowned by the hammering of his own pulse. Each movement was prescribed, each gesture a thread in the tapestry of centuries. Lift the bowl just so, turn it twice, no once counterclockwise. But his muscles betrayed him, stiff and inelegant, his wrists tight as unyielding oak. The silence of the taroom, usually a balm, now pressed against him like the weight of his ancestors' gazes. He could almost hear the disappointed sighs of generations of swordsmen, their portraits lining the dojo walls, their katanas sheathed, but no less sharp in judgment. His breath hitched a falter that would have earned him a swift reproach from his master. The old man's voice echoed in his mind. Perfection is not in the hand, but in the breath. Yet, how could his breath be steady when his heart was a storm? The scent of pine resin from the alcove's incense coiled around him, thick as his shame. He imagined his father's face, stern and unreadable, watching from the shadows. A bead of sweat traced his spine. The tea's bitter steam swirled upward, a fleeting ghost. And for a moment, he was a child again, clutching a wooden bokyudo too heavy for his small hands, tripping over his own feet in the courtyard. The other students' laughter sharper than any blade. He closed his eyes. Somewhere beyond the garden, a temple bell tolled, its deep resonance reverberating through the air like a ripple across still water. The sound pulled him back to the present, to the mat, to the bowl cradled in his palms. The weight was familiar now, the rhythm of his breathing slower, deeper. The morning light shifted, painting golden seams along the floorboards, and in that glow he glimpsed the truth. The ceremony was not a test, but a mirror. Each flawed motion reflected not failure, but the path itself. The tea would be poured, bitter and perfect in its imperfection. The leaves would fall, the seasons turn, the katanas rust, yet the art would remain. His fingers stilled, the tremor faded, and as he raised the chowan to his lips, the taste was not of shame, but of something quieter, simpler. The first step toward mastery and the peace it promised. The scent of fresh tatami mingled with the earthy bitterness of matcha as the young samurai knelt in the dim light of the dojo. His calloused fingers tracing the smooth curve of his sheathed katana. The morning air, crisp with the promise of autumn, carried the distant cry of a hawk, and the rhythmic clatter of geta on cobblestone sounds that seemed to echo the restless pulse of his own thoughts. His spine was straight, his posture flawless, yet beneath the taut silk of his kimono, his muscles trembled. The weight of his ancestors' names pressed upon his shoulders like armor, each breath a silent plea, do not falter. Shadows stretched long across the polished wooden floor, and as sunlight pooled around his master's aged hands, the old man poured tea with a stillness that belied the storms he must have weathered. The cup, warm against his palms, felt like a relic of something sacred. "I once severed a man's thumb by accident," his master murmured. The words a blade slipped between ribs. The confession hung in the air, thinner than steam rising from the tea. The young samurai's breath caught. His master's failures were unthinkable, yet here they lay between them, as plain as the scar that twisted the old man's knuckles. Outside, a maple leaf spiraled to the ground, autumn's quiet reminder of surrender. The master's voice was softer now, woven with the wisdom of decades. The sword does not demand perfection. It demands only that you lift it again. The bitter tea lingered on his tongue, its astringency a mirror to his own sharp self-reproach. He remembered the countless nights spent drilling forms until his hands bled, the dreams where his ancestors turned their backs in silence. Yet here was his master, flawed and fearless, his gaze steady as the moon reflected in a still pond. The katana at his side seemed lighter suddenly, not a chain to his legacy, but a bridge across time, linking him to every warrior who had ever stumbled before finding their balance. Wind sighed through the shoji screens, carrying the scent of damp earth and distant pine. For the first time, he noticed the way his master's hands cradled the teacup, not with the rigidity of a soldier, but the reverence of a man who knew fragility intimately. The sun climbed higher, gilding the streaks of gray in the old man's hair. And as the young samurai exhaled, he felt something unknot in his chest. The path to mastery was not a straight line cut through the world, but a spiral endless, patient, folding back on itself like the layers of a folded blade. Somewhere beyond the dojo, a temple bell tolled, its resonance humming in his bones as if the gods themselves were whispering, "Begin again." The young samurai knelt on the sun-warmed tatami, the clean scent of woven rush mingling with the sharp, earthy bitterness of freshly whisked matcha. His calloused fingers curled around the chowan, the ceramic warm against his palms, steam curling like the ghosts of his ancestors watching, waiting. Outside, the garden lay quiet, save for the whisper of wind through cherry blossoms, pink petals trembling on branches like his own unspoken doubts. He inhaled, slow and deliberate, the way his master had taught him decades ago, when his hands were still small enough to cradle a wooden bakken without trembling. Now, the weight of his family's legacy pressed heavier than any blade, the names of his forefathers etched into his bones like the kanji on tombstones. The tea burned his tongue, a familiar sting, a mirror to the fire in his chest, that relentless drive to perfect every cut, every stance, to carve his name into history without dishonoring those who came before. He set the bowl down with exaggerated care, the faint clink of porcelain on wood echoing like a struck bell. Rising, he slid his katana from its sheath, a sound like ice splitting, a single, flawless note in the stillness. The blade caught the afternoon light, its edge humming with the memory of 1,000 folds, of smiths who had prayed over steel as if it were a living thing. He stepped onto the weathered deck, the wood smooth under his bare feet, still damp with morning dew. The first stance came naturally, his body moving as if guided by the unseen hands of his master, his ancestors, the gods themselves. His breath synced with the rhythm of his swings, each cut precise, each movement an offering. But then the wind shifted. A sakura petal spiraled past his face, brushing his cheek like a fingertip, fragile as his concentration. He hesitated just a fraction, and the moment shattered. A storm growled in the distance, the air thickening with the scent of rain and turned earth. The sky darkened as if the gods had spilled ink across the heavens, and the first fat drops struck the stones like thrown pebbles. Wind roared through the garden, tearing blossoms from their branches, a whirl of pink and white like snow in reverse. Petals stuck to his damp skin, his hakama flapping like the wings of a trapped bird. His grip tightened on the sword, knuckles bleaching white. Again, he thought, again I falter. The bitterness in his throat wasn't just from the tea. Around him, the storm howled, and he imagined it was the voice of his master, of his father disappointment sharp as a blade's kiss. But then a memory surfaced, his master's withered hands adjusting his stance not with chastisement, but with patience. The cherry blossom falls when it must, the old man had said, but the tree does not begrudge the wind. The young samurai stilled. Rain streamed down his face like tears, cleansing, cooling the fever of his shame. He let out a breath long held, watching it disperse into the storm. Around him, the blossoms swirled, not in chaos, but in dance each petal a lesson in impermanence, in surrender. Slowly he sheathed his sword, the click of the guard like a full stop to his racing thoughts. The storm would pass. The blossoms would return, and he would rise with them, not in spite of the wind, but because of it. The morning air clung to the young samurai's skin, cool and damp, as the first light seeped through the paper-thin shoji screens, painting the dojo's tatami mats in pale gold. The scent of fresh straw and polished cypress wood mingled with the faint, bitter aroma of matcha, whisked to perfection by his master's gnarled hands, a ritual as precise as the draw of a blade. He knelt, spine rigid, palms flat against his thighs, and inhaled deeply, as if he could trap the stillness inside him. But beneath the discipline, his ribs quivered like a plucked bowstring. The weight of generations pressed upon his shoulders. Portraits of stern-faced ancestors watched from the alcove, their lacquered frames gleaming dully in the half-light. He had memorized every stroke of their calligraphy, every scar on their swords, and yet his own hands, though calloused, felt clumsy in comparison, unworthy of the silk-wrapped hilt resting at his side. Outside, a sakura petal drifted past the open door, its descent unhurried, indifferent. He caught himself tracking its path, the way it trembled in the breeze, veered off course, and still landed without sound. His fingertips dug into his knees. Perfection is a single cut, his father had said. One motion, seamless as the moon's arc, but the petals fell as they pleased, crooked, flawed, ephemeral, and the world did not condemn them. The thought unraveled something tight in his chest. His master's teacup clinked softly against its saucer, a sound like temple bells in the distance. The old man did not speak, but his silence was a lesson. The boy exhaled, long and slow, and as he did, he noticed the way the steam from his own cup curled upward, dissolving into nothingness. The hearth's embers pulsed like a heartbeat. The wind rustled the scrolls on the wall, their edges fluttering like wounded wings. For the first time, he saw the dojo not as a shrine to unattainable ideals, but as a living thing breathed in, breathed out, shaped by every crack in the floorboards, every errant stroke of ink. His hand hovered over his katana, hesitated, then withdrew. The blade could wait. Above him, the sakura branches swayed, scattering petals like torn prayers, each one a fleeting testament to something older than duty, older than shame, the quiet beauty of surrender. That night, beneath a silver crescent moon, casting delicate shadows across the rippled surface of the garden pond, the young samurai knelt upon the tatami mat, its woven reeds scenting the air with the faint, clean aroma of sun-baked earth and straw. The shoji screens stood open, allowing the cool night breeze to brush against his skin, carrying with it the distant fragrance of pine and the damp musk of moss-cloaked stones. His hands rested lightly on his thighs, fingers trembling ever so slightly, not from fatigue, but from the relentless drumbeat of expectation that echoed in his mind like the solemn toll of a temple bell. Every breath he drew was deliberate, slow, the sharp, herbal bitterness of matcha still lingering on his tongue from the evening's ritual. A reminder of his master's teachings. To seek perfection is to chase the moon's reflection in water. The words reverberated within him, clashing against the whispers of his ancestors, whose portraits lined the alcove's stern faces etched with the weight of battles won and honor preserved. The smooth lacquer of his sheathed katana lay beside him, its polished saya cool beneath his fingertips, a silent companion in his solitude. Outside, the rhythmic clatter of a night heron's steps on the cobbled path mirrored the unsteady cadence of his thoughts, each one a wound tighter than the silk of his hakama. What if I falter? What if my blade hesitates? Above, the moon drifted behind a wisp of cloud, dimming the garden's glow just enough that the fireflies emerged, their fragile lights flickering like the last embers of a dying resolve. He closed his eyes, letting the sounds of the night envelop him, the chirrup of crickets, the whisper of leaves brushing against timber, the distant rush of the river that had carved these valleys long before his family's name was spoken. In the stillness, he imagined himself as that water, patient and unyielding, wearing away stone not by force, but by persistence. His breath deepened, shoulders easing as the weight of his fears began to dissolve like ink in a stream. The tension in his jaw softened, and for the first time in weeks, he felt the taut coil of his spine unwind, muscle by muscle. A memory surfaced: his master's gnarled hands, steady as they guided his grip on the sword, the old man's voice as weathered as the temple beams overhead. The gods do not demand perfection. They demand presence. The night air seemed to hum with the truth of it, as though the very stars were threads in a tapestry woven by generations of warriors who had knelt just as he did now. Hearts laid bare beneath the same indifferent sky. A single maple leaf, loosened by the breeze, spiraled down to land upon the pond's surface, sending fragile ripples across the moon's reflection, once sharp, now shimmering, fractured yet beautiful. He exhaled, long and slow, watching as stillness returned to the water, as the mirrored crescent mended itself. Here, in this quiet collision of earth and sky, between the press of history and the pull of his own trembling spirit, he understood. Mastery was not a summit to conquer, but a path to walk, step by step, breath by breath. The ancestors need not be chains, they could be lanterns. And so, as the fireflies danced and the night deepened, he let go not of duty, nor of discipline, but of the gnawing fear that had lived like a knot beneath his ribs. The moon bathed his face in its pale light, and for the first time, he did not flinch beneath its gaze. The morning air was crisp, with the scent of pine and damp earth, the last remnants of dew clinging to the cobbled path as the young samurai in training made his way to the dojo, his geta clattering rhythmically against the stones. Inside, the clean, straw fragrance of tatami mats mingled with the faint bitterness of green tea steeping on a low table, its steam curling like incense in the slanting sunlight. As he knelt, the smooth, cool touch of polished wooden floorboards beneath his palms grounded him, though his heartbeat was a restless echo in his chest. Again, his father's voice whispered in memory, "A single hesitation is the difference between honor and disgrace." The sword master's weathered hands had moved like water, effortless and sure. But his own fingers, calloused, yet trembling, had yet to find that certainty. Today, though, something shifted. As he lifted the katana, the blade whispered from its scabbard with a sound like a breath held too long. And for the first time, he did not fight the weight of it. His stance widened, knees bending as if rooted to the earth, and the movements came not as calculations, but as steps in a dance he had always known. The sword arced, cutting through the honeyed light, and though his angle was imperfect, though his footing stuttered, there was a rhythm to it, a pulse that matched the slow, deliberate cadence of his breaths. He thought of the cherry blossoms outside, how they fell without apology, how the wind carried them where it willed. Trust, the sword master had said, is the bridge between fear and mastery. The blade dipped, rose, and for a fleeting moment, he saw not the shadow of his ancestors' expectations, but his own reflection in the polished steel, flawed, yet unbroken. The tea beside him had gone cold, but its bitterness now tasted like revelation. The young samurai in training knelt upon the sun-warmed tatami, the faint scent of fresh straw and polished wood grounding him as he arranged his aching limbs into seiza. His fingertips brushed the smooth silk of his hakama, cool against his skin as the morning air whispered through the open shoji, carrying the earthy fragrance of damp moss from the courtyard stones. Before him, steam curled from his chowan, the bitter green tea within reflecting his own face pale, drawn, shadows beneath his eyes like smudged ink. He had trained until his hands shook, until the blisters on his palms split and stained his bokuten's hilt with blood he would scrub away before dawn. The weight of generations pressed upon his shoulders, his father's victories, his grandfather's poems of cherry blossoms falling in battle, the unbroken line of honor stretching back to the gods themselves. A single misstep, a single lapse in focus, and their legacy would crumble like ash in his unworthy hands. His breath faltered, then stilled, as the soft rustle of his master's kimono broke the silence. The old man knelt beside him, the whisper of his joints like bamboo groves settling in the wind, and lifted the tea with hands that had wielded a katana with lethal grace for 60 years. The blade's song that barely their hiss of steel freed from its saya echoed in the boy's memory, a sound more intimate than his own heartbeat. "The sword is a mirror," his master murmured, the words settling like temple bells fading into mist. "It shows the soul before it cuts the flesh." Outside, a maple leaf spiraled onto the veranda, crimson as the scars of past battles, and for the first time, the apprentice noticed how the light gilded his master's wrinkles into rivers of gold. The old swordsman smiled as he sipped, the bitterness seeming to sweeten on his tongue. To seek perfection is to chase the moon on water, he said. The boy inhaled, tasting iron and pine and the coming autumn, feeling the tremor in his hands soften as the ritual grounded him not in fear, but in presence. The cicadas drone, the distant clatter of kata on cobblestones, the tea's warmth radiating through the ceramic, and into his palms all of it wove together, stitch by meticulous stitch, into the tapestry of this moment, not the ghosts of the past, nor the specter of failure, but the quiet certainty of a path walked one breath, one strike, one sunrise at a time. His master nodded then, and the weight of approval lifted something nameless from the boy's chest. The katana's edge, he realized, was not meant to carve glory from the void, but to pare away the self until only truth remained. As the tea leaves settled at the bottom of the bowl, so too did his resolve, sinking deep as roots into fertile earth. The young samurai knelt on the tatami mat, the woven reeds releasing a faint, clean scent of straw and sunlight as he settled into stillness. The morning air was cool against his skin, brushing over the loose folds of his silk kimono like the whisper of a ghost, perhaps one of his ancestors. Watching, he closed his eyes, exhaling slowly, and the world narrowed to the weight of the katana resting across his lap, its lacquered scabbard smooth under his calloused fingertips. Outside, the distant clatter of kata on cobblestones echoed like a metronome, marking time as the village awoke. But here, in the dojo's hushed dimness, even the scrape of a blade drawn from its sheath would have been a disturbance. He imagined it anyway. The almost imperceptible hiss of steel, the way the edge caught the light in a single, lethal gleam. His fingers twitched not with nervousness, but with the memory of 1,000 repetitions, each movement honed until it felt less like action and more like prayer. Master Kobayashi had once told him that the sword was a bridge between earth and heaven, its polish a mirror for the soul. The thought tightened his throat. For weeks now, the ache of perfection had been replaced by something quieter, deeper, a curiosity that unfurled like the steam rising from the bitter green tea beside him, its aroma sharp and cleansing. No longer did his mind snag on the fear of dishonor, the crushing weight of generations judging his every step. Instead, there was only the rhythm of breath, the way his muscles recalled their duties without demand, each strike and stance flowing as naturally as the creek behind the dojo, its waters carving stone with patient insistence. He opened his eyes. Dawn had crept across the wooden floorboards, gilding the dust motes that drifted like spirits in the pale light. Slowly, deliberately, he lifted the cup to his lips, the ceramic warm against his skin. The tea's bitterness bloomed on his tongue, a reminder that mastery, like the seasons, required both swallowing bitterness and savoring the clarity it brought. Somewhere beyond the shoji screens, a sparrow trilled, its song stitching the silence into something alive, something fleeting and perfect. The sword, the tea, the bird, all were threads in the same tapestry, woven by time and discipline. He smiled, just slightly. For the first time in years, he felt no need to grasp for greatness. It was enough to kneel here, to breathe, to let the echoes of his ancestors settle into his bones like the calm after a storm. The evening air hung still, heavy with the scent of pine, and the faint, clean aroma of freshly woven tatami mats from the dojo behind him. The young samurai in training, Kazuki, knelt on the smooth wooden engawa, his calloused fingers resting lightly on the lacquered scabbard of his katana. The polished wood beneath him was cool, a quiet contrast to the lingering warmth of the day's sun. Somewhere beyond the garden wall, the rhythmic clatter of geta on cobbled streets faded into the twilight, a distant echo of the world moving on without him. He closed his eyes, breathing deeply, the bitter aftertaste of matcha still lingering on his tongue from the tea shared with his sword master, whose words weighed heavier than the blade at his hip. Perfection is not in the sword's edge, but in the soul that guides it. The pressure coiled in his chest like a taut bowstring. His family's crest, embroidered in silk threads upon his gi, seemed to burn against his skin, a constant reminder of the ancestors who had walked this path before him, their deeds etched into history like characters in an unending scroll. With a shuddering exhale, he rose, the silk of his hakama whispering against his legs as he stepped into the courtyard. The gravel beneath his feet crunched softly, each step measured, deliberate. The katana slid from its sheath with a whisper, a sound so sharp it seemed to slice the very air, leaving silence in its wake. Then he moved. His body became an extension of the blade, arcs of steel catching the last amber light of dusk, as if drawing constellations into the gathering dark. His muscles remembered the kata with a precision his mind could never dictate, each motion flowing into the next like water over stone. And then, a breath, a pause. The world held still. The sparrows in the nearby maple froze mid-chirp. The wind died. For that suspended moment, he was no longer Kazuki, the boy who trembled at the weight of his name. He was the motion, the silence, the space between heartbeats. The universe breathed with him, but then his fingertips twitched, a tremor so slight only the gods might have noticed. The spell shattered. The birds took flight in a rush of wings, and the wind returned, carrying with it the distant chime of a temple bell. His throat tightened. Had it been enough? Would the ancestors have been proud, or would they have seen only the hesitation, the flaw? His chest ached with the old fear, that no matter how fiercely he trained, how deeply he bowed, he would never be more than a shadow of those who came before. The katana's blade gleamed, reflecting not just his face, but the cherry blossoms drifting down like snow, ephemeral, beautiful, doomed to fade. His sword master's voice murmured in his memory, even the finest steel must bend before it can hold an edge. A lesson in patience, in surrender. Slowly, he sheathed the blade, the click of the guard meeting the scabbard a solemn promise to endure, to persist. The stars above blinked into existence, ancient and unwavering, as if to remind him that mastery was not a destination, but a path walked one breath, one stroke, one fragile moment of unity at a time. The scent of sun-warmed tatami and fresh matcha curled through the dojo, clean and sharp as the edge of a blade. Ren's fingers trembled against his thigh only once, imperceptible to anyone but himself as his master knelt before the family altar. Incense smoke weaving through the air like the ghosts of ancestors watching. The old man's hands, gnarled as ancient pine roots, lifted the katana from its silk wrapping with a whisper of steel against cloth. A sound so precise it seemed to cut the very silence. Outside, the wind stirred the cherry blossoms. Petals brushed the shoji screens like hesitant knuckles. Ready, his master had said, but the word coiled in Ren's gut like a live thing. Ready to face the duel, yes, but ready to bear the weight of his father's name, his grandfather's victories, the unbroken line of honor stretching back to the era of gods and demons. The tea in his mouth turned bitter, not from the matcha's natural tang, but from the memory of his father's last strained breath, the way his hand had clenched Ren's wrist like a man drowning. Do not shame us. The cup between his palms was smooth, glazed by generations of potters, yet his grip threatened to crack it. A breath. The morning light shifted, sliding gold across the polished floorboards, and in that slow, suspended moment, Ren let his eyes fall shut. The clatter of kata on cobblestones echoed from the street beyond the garden, a rhythmic counterpoint to the distant temple bell time moving on, indifferent. His master exhaled, long and steady, a tide pulling back, and Ren mirrored him, feeling his pulse settle into the cadence of meditation. The katana's tsuka, cool against his palm, seemed to hum with silent expectation. This was not merely steel, but the soul of the forge fire, the river's patience in tempering, the wind's grace in the swing. To falter now would dishonor not just his bloodline, but the craftsmen, the masters, the very earth that had shaped the blade. A sparrow landed on the veranda, cocking its head, and for a heartbeat, Ren envied its simplicity no legacy, only the next seed, the next flutter of wings. Then the breeze stilled. The master's voice, when it came, was soft as worn silk. The sword is empty until you fill it. Ren opened his eyes. The petal-strewn path to the dueling ground awaited, each step a covenant. He rose, the weight of his hakama whispering against his calves like approving voices. And as his feet met the earth, he felt it not certainty, but the first fragile note of peace. Mastery was not the absence of fear, but the discipline to carry it. The blade, unsheathed, caught the sun in a single, blinding flash, ephemeral as cherry blossoms, endless as the sky. The morning mist clung to the cobbled path like a sigh, as the young samurai stepped forward, his geta clattering in a slow, deliberate rhythm against the stone. The air carried the crisp scent of dew-kissed moss, and the faint, earthy aroma of freshly swept tatami from the dojo he'd left behind. His fingers, calloused from years of practice, brushed against the silk of his hakama, smooth and cool, a contrast to the heat coiled tight in his chest. Today, the weight of his katana at his hip felt different, heavier not with the burden of steel, but with the ghosts of his ancestors, their unblinking eyes watching from the shadows of his mind. He inhaled deeply, the sharp, herbal bite of green tea still lingering on his tongue from the morning's ritual, its bitterness a mirror to the knot in his throat. Perfection or disgrace, there is no middle ground. The thought hummed beneath his pulse, rhythmic as the distant temple bell tolling through the mist. Across the courtyard, his opponent stood like a rooted pine, still, unshaken. The samurai exhaled, long and slow, willing his breath to steady the tremor in his hands. He remembered his master's words, spoken in the quiet gloom of the dojo, the scent of aged wood and polished bamboo wrapping around them like a prayer. The sword is an extension of the soul. Fear is the gap between stroke and intention. The memory tangled with the scent of incense, the flicker of candlelight, the way his master's gnarled hands had cradled the teacup, fragile, yet unbreakable. Now, beneath the pale glow of dawn, he mirrored that stillness. His fingers flexed, recalling the grip of the hilt, the whisper of the blade leaving its sheath, a sound so sharp it could split the world between before and after. A breeze stirred, carrying the distant murmur of the river, the rustle of maple leaves like a chorus of hidden spirits. The samurai's gaze never wavered, but he felt the shift the way the light gilded his opponent's shoulders, the subtle tension in their stance like a bowstring drawn taut. In that suspended moment, time frayed. He was a boy again, kneeling on sun-warmed tatami, his father's sword displayed above the alcove, its polished scabbard reflecting the cherry blossoms outside. "To honor is to endure," his father had said, voice rough as unpolished stone. The memory dissolved into the present, the creak of leather, the metallic tang of anticipation, the cool kiss of sweat trickling down his spine. His breath hitched only once before he let it go, releasing the doubt like an arrow loosed from its quiver. The duel began. There was no rush, no fury, only the seamless unspooling of motion, his body moving as water flows, as history repeats. His blade met its twin in a clash that rang like temple steel, the vibration humming through his bones, ancestral voices murmuring in the resonance. This is not merely a fight, he realized, but a language. Each parry, each step, a brushstroke on the scroll of his lineage. The fear that had gnawed at him of failure, of fading into obscurity, melted like morning frost beneath the sun. Here, in the space between heartbeats, he found not perfection, but something truer. The quiet certainty of a path walked with resolve, the peace of a mind unshaken as the mountains. When the final stroke fell, it was not victory that filled him. but stillness the kind his master sought in tea ceremonies. In the steam rising like a bridge between earth and heaven, the opponent bowed and he returned the gesture, their shared breath mingling with the scent of trampled grass and iron. As he sheathed his sword, the click of the guard settling home was a promise. To his ancestors, to himself, the sun climbed higher, its warmth brushing his face like a blessing. Today, he had not conquered an enemy, but the storm within. And in that surrender, he was free. The crisp scent of freshly woven tatami mingled with the faint, earthy bitterness of matcha, the steam curling like mist over a morning river. The young samurai knelt in the training hall, his fingertips brushing the smooth, cool wood of his sheathed katana, its touch as familiar as his own heartbeat. Outside, the rhythmic clatter of geta on cobblestones echoed the pulse of the city waking. But here, the world was hushed, suspended in the space between breaths. The duel had ended in a draw, yet his chest felt light, unburdened for the first time in years. He had expected the familiar sting of failure, the weight of his ancestors' gaze pressing down like storm-heavy clouds. But instead, there was only stillness. The blade he had drawn with trembling hands hours ago had sung its sharp, whispering him a sound so precise it seemed to slice the very air. And in that moment, he had understood. The teachings of his master, the old man's voice like wind through bamboo, returned to him. Perfection is not a destination, but the path itself. His fingers traced the silk wrap of the hilt, remembering the way his opponent's eyes had widened in mutual recognition, their blades pausing mid-strike, united in reverence for the dance. The morning light slanted through the shoji screens, painting gold across the wooden floor, and he watched dust motes swirl like cherry blossoms caught in a breeze. He exhaled, long and slow, feeling the knot in his shoulders unravel. The tea in his cup had gone cold, its bitterness softened now, like the edges of his relentless striving. In the quiet, he heard the distant call of a temple bell, its deep resonance humming through his bones, a reminder of time's endless cycle, how generations of swordsmen had knelt where he now sat, their fears and triumphs as fleeting as the seasons. The polished wood beneath his palms carried the memory of countless hands, the sweat and tears of those who had come before. And for the first time, he felt not crushed by their legacy, but held by it. The wind stirred, carrying the scent of pine from the mountains, and he closed his eyes, letting it wash over him. There would be more duels, more days of calloused fingers and aching limbs, but here, now in this breath, there was only peace. The journey was enough. The wooden gate creaked softly as he pushed it open, the scent of aged cedar mingling with the crisp autumn air, pungent with fallen leaves and the distant smoke of hearth fires. Inside the dojo, the tatami mats exhaled their clean, grassy fragrance, woven with whispers of dried reeds and sunlit fields long gone. His master knelt before the low table, the steam from the iron kettle curling like temple incense, and the sharp, vegetal aroma of matcha bit the air bitter. alive. The old man's hands moved with the quiet certainty of river currents, fingertips brushing the chowin's rim, the ceramic smooth as a pebble worn by time. Outside, wind stirred the maple leaves, their rustling a counterpoint to the kettle's low simmer. But here, the world narrowed to the stillness between breaths. The young samurai hesitated at the threshold, his kata scraping faintly on the worn stone step, its rough texture a whisper of his own incompleteness. His fingers flexed at his sides, still humming with the phantom weight of his katana that split-second falter in his draw earlier. The blade's song imperfect, skipping like a stone across water, shame pooled under his ribs. Would his ancestors hear that hesitation? See the tremor in his stance? Yet as he stepped forward, the polished floorboards cool beneath his bare feet, his master did not turn, did not chide. Only the steam rose between them, a veil of transience. He knelt, the silk of his hakusa whispering against his thighs, its blue dusk deep and flecked with unseen constellations. The master slid the chowin toward him, its glaze flawed in one infinitesimal place, a jagged thread of imperfection beneath the gloss, like the crack in a temple bell that lets the divine in. Their fingers did not touch. The tea's surface trembled at his exhale. He caught his reflection in the jade-dark liquid, warped and shifting. For a heartbeat, he was a boy again, shivering before his father's armor in the ancestral hall, the lacquered plates staring back like a face of blackened bone. Honor is not flawless steel, the master had once said, but the hand that steadies when the blade sings off-key. The bitterness burst on his tongue, not punishment, but awakening. Shadows lengthened across the mats like ink bleeding through parchment, the room breathing with the pulse of the hanging scrolls' brushed characters. Harmony, balance, the weightlessness of acceptance. Somewhere beyond the shoji screens, a crow called, its cry fraying into the wind. The master's untouched cup caught the last slant of light, gold pooling in its hollow. No words passed, yet the air thickened with the weight of countless such silences, their shared history steeped like tea leaves in this ritual. The young samurai's thumb traced the chowin's fissure, its edges worn smooth from handling. To be broken was to be known. The pressure in his chest unraveled, grain by grain, each breath a tide pulling back from the shore. When the master finally lifted his own cup, the liquid trembled, too. A fleeting imperfection held tenderly in his gnarled hands. They drank as the dusk deepened, the taste of bitter green dissolving into something akin to sweetness. As the dusk deepened into night, the young samurai knelt upon the tatami mat, the clean, grassy scent of woven straw mingling with the faintly bitter aroma of freshly whisked matcha. The thin porcelain cup warmed his palms, its heat a quiet contrast to the cool evening air that seeped through the shoji screens, carrying with it the distant murmur of the village below, the rhythmic clatter of geta on cobblestones, the occasional snap of a merchant's banner in the wind. Outside, The first stars pricked the indigo sky, and the faintest sliver of moon hung like the edge of a polished blade. His sword lay beside him, its saya gleaming in the low lantern light, and as he exhaled slowly, he imagined the almost imperceptible whisper of steel being drawn, a sound so precise it seemed to cut the silence itself. His fingers trembled just slightly as he lifted the tea to his lips, the bitterness lingering on his tongue like the weight of his family's name. He closed his eyes and saw again the stern faces of his ancestors lining the shadows of the dojo, their judgments etched into the grain of the wooden beams overhead. The pressure coiled in his chest, tight as the grip on a hilt before battle. He set the cup down, the ceramic tapping softly against the polished wood of the tray, and focused on the slow rise and fall of his breath. Each inhale carried the scent of pine from the incense curling lazily toward the ceiling. Each exhale loosened the knot in his shoulders, if only by a fraction. The lantern's flame flickered, casting trembling shapes across the walls, dancing like the ghosts of warriors long gone. He wondered if they too had wrestled with this fear, this dread of stumbling beneath the weight of expectation. His master's voice returned to him then, gentle but unwavering. Perfection is not the absence of flaw, but the grace with which one rises after the fall. The words settled into his bones like the hum of a temple bell, resonating through the hollows of his doubt. Outside, a breeze stirred the bamboo grove, leaves brushing against one another in a sound like rainfall, and he imagined the gods whispering secrets to those patient enough to listen. His fingertips traced the edge of his hakama, the silk smooth beneath his calluses, a reminder of the countless hours spent in practice, in failure, in relentless pursuit. The night stretched before him, vast and forgiving, and for the first time in weeks, he did not feel the urge to fill it with restless motion. Instead, he let himself be still. The weight of his ancestors' legacy was not a chain, but a thread woven into something greater, something that extended beyond him, beyond even the edges of time. Mastery was not a destination, but the sum of these quiet moments, the bitter tea, the trembling hands, the silent prayers offered to the dark. And as the candlelight flickered once more, he bowed his head, not in submission, but in gratitude for the journey, for the peace it had begun to carve within him, slow and sure as the path of a river through stone.